and how things might change, should change, perhaps should not change as we see this technological change. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Amina Fazula, who is the policy director for the Benton Foundation, was caught up at National Airport this morning when there was the tragedy at the Navy Yards in Washington, and the airport was closed for several hours, and her plane was on the tarmac and sat there for a while, and then went back to the gate. So she cannot possibly make it here in time. So we are missing her perspective, but hoping that she may make it later in the week and we can add her to another panel. So we're down to 2 speakers, but these are 2 really remarkable speakers. I'm actually going to hand it over to them. I'm not going to say much other than that Nick Miller's from Best and Krieger, Jim Baller's from the Baller-Herbst Law Group. Hopefully, most if not all of you know them or know of them. And I'll say only by way of introduction, I'm not going to read their bios because you have all that, but I'll say by way of introduction, they are both legends in the world of community communications, 2 of the most important and effective longtime advocates for local governments and communications, and it's an enormous privilege to have them here and to sit with them on this at this table. How about that? So I'm going to say we'll have 2 presentations because they've got a lot of information to share, and then take some questions. But I think if questions come up during, are you both amenable to?
Sure. Yes.
Great. Terrific.
No.
Questions for?
I'll take his questions.
Set yourself up there. All right, we're going to have Nick first. Nick, take it away.
I'm going to actually relocate because my presentation is over here. Let me get organized here before I actually, excuse me, Jim, for reaching in front of you. Okay, I bet there's a way to get this to move. I need help. This is locked.
Try escape.
Try escape? Yeah. Okay, that did it. Got it. Okay, I'm all right. I think I got it now. Thanks. Yeah, this is the, thank you. Sorry for the alarm. Sorry for the alarm. Okay, now we got to hit the full screen. Okay, got it. Excuse the delay and the pause. It's a real honor to be here. Joanne has had an interesting 2 years as president of NATOA, and I think we all owe her an enormous debt of gratitude for what has happened within the organization during the 2 years and where we are as we go forward from here. So it's particularly an honor to be up here with Joanne as the moderator. Jim has also, as you'll hear more, I'm sure, from his presentation, been in the front lines the last 5 to 6 years, particularly on the issue of municipal ownership and cities taking control of their own destinies and dealing with the reality of where they are. What I wanted to do today, because I've been around a long time. I think I'm going to say, I think I'm going to say that I'm a student of history. and so I wanted to, I really jumped at the opportunity to participate with Jim and Joanne this afternoon because it is a conversation I feel like we have not had very effectively, either within the NATOA community or with our broader bosses, the local elected officials and the senior administrators of our communities, or with our national associations that are actually carrying our messages up to Congress. And so it's really important to get a framework in mind, both about what's at stake and how to think about these issues in a way that they can be translated both in terms of their urgency and their importance, which is, there's been, in some ways, I feel like, as we've watched the IP transition develop, and we've watched the transition from the Powell FCC to the Obama years and the Hunt FCC, there's been almost a transcendent, an existential silence about issues that were so dominant in the conversation in the 80s and 90s that it's almost a parallel universe when I reflect on what was going on in the 80s and 90s versus what's been going on since in the 2000s. And I personally had some hope that that would change when the Obama administration would put new leadership at the FCC and really confront some of the legal conundrums that the earlier panel today discussed that has led to this crazy world where you can choose to be unregulated. I wish that's kind of like choosing to not pay your taxes. How did we get here, and what does that say about where we go? So what I want to do is try to give you some sense of what's happening and some potential answers to that. What I'm going to talk on briefly is what are the principles that ought to apply to when you think about a social compact in an IP world. Second, I think this is fundamentally informed by economics and what we see happening in the marketplace. And then I want to dwell a little bit on the 80s and 90s in terms of what is the traditional social compact that we've insisted upon with the telecommunications providers. And here I'm not using telecommunications in the strict legal sense of the Powell administration. I'm talking about folks who use wires or use wireless facilities to send information. I'm talking about the underlying providers of the networks. And then the question gets immediately to this seminar, which is, okay, how does IP technology affect that experience of the 80s and 90s? Should it affect it? How does it affect it? And kind of where does that leave us, the people in this room, in terms of what our duty is, both to our citizens, our taxpayers, and our bosses? Folks who have heard me talk before, this will be relatively old hat at one level. I think it's relatively important when you're talking about what is essentially a political discussion, because what we're talking about is big chunks of money and who walks out of the room with that money. That is, at essence, a political economic discussion. You have to keep clearly in mind your self-interests and the interests of the people you represent. And I think from local government standpoint, which we are all here representing, there's fundamentally four interests when you start talking about the telecommunications world. One, the consumer's interest prevails. It is the lodestar that we all have to follow. Because if the consumers are successful, all kinds of good things happen in our community, and if consumers are not successful, all kinds of bad things happen in our community, not the least of which our bosses tend to get unelected. The second lodestar for local governments is the actual economic development of the community. When you start talking about jobs, you start talking about community regeneration, you start talking about educational opportunity. That all fits under that rubric of, is the policy advancing the overall economic welfare of the community? The third is not commonly confronted, but boy, the industry knows it, even if our electeds don't. We as local government are the largest landlord the industry has. If you sit at if you look at a traditional business pro forma for the normal corporation, you will see that they spend somewhere between 20 and 35% of their annual operating expenses for rent. In other words, you got to have a place where you do business, and you got to spend money on that space. And that real estate cost is a substantial part of the cost of doing business, unless you are in a truly virtual business. Well, in fact, the telecommunications networks are not in a virtual business. They're in a very physical business that requires the physical occupancy of a whole lot of real estate called right-of-way. So when you actually look at the amount of money that AT&T spends on real estate, it tends to be 8 to 10% as opposed to 30. Why? Because effectively they're getting free real estate from us for the other 20%. So we are the biggest landlord that these companies face, and that gives us both trustee responsibilities to our taxpayers as well as serious business questions as we think about the deals we're prepared to do for that real estate. And then finally, local government tends to be the anchor tenant for all of these telecommunications networks. In most communities, you will, if you actually aggregate, we don't do a very good job of doing this in the budget level, but if you aggregate all the local government uses of telecommunications, you start putting together your cellular bills, you put together your telephone bills, you put together your cable bills, you put together your data networking bills, you start aggregating that all together, you will find that you are the first, second, or third largest user of telecommunications in your community. So part of what's happening here is you have a customer-vendor relationship with the telecommunications companies. Going back over that briefly, so I'm talking about our standpoint. I'm talking about local government's interest here. I'm talking about the social compact local governments need to be thinking about. We have to be concerned about consumers, and the way you protect consumers is you protect them against market failures. When does competition not serve when is competition not there? Or when does competition not address the real issues that are the experience? And they tend to track monopoly power in the marketplace. The second in the consumer protection is the quality of life of the community. And that's where we get into what can become really diversionary issues, very important. Things like First Amendment, opportunities to speak, abuses of privacy. These are very complex, tangential issues to what I think is essentially the social compact that we have to work as a local community with the carriers who are providing the network. On economic development, there's the issue of how do we assure that everyone in the community has a fair opportunity to participate? Are we, in fact, using the community's resources efficiently? If you allow a company to build in the right-of-way, is that going to drive cost for other users of the rights-of-way? If you actually sit down, I always think in terms, I always encourage people to think in terms, think about the number of hours a commuter spends sitting in a traffic jam because a right-of-way is being trenched. If you aggregated the actual economic value of 10,000 consumers spending an extra hour a day getting to and from work because instead of coordinating construction in the right-of-way, we allow seriatim construction in the right-of-way, with one company trenches and another company trenches and another company trenches. If you could aggregate that money, you'd begin to realize very quickly that there's a terrific tax being imposed on your community if you're not managing that rights away and insisting on compliance with that management in a sensible way. I've talked about the landlord as trustee and the government as user. The issue with the government as user, to me, breaks in two places. One is, if we're paying too much, then the taxpayer's accepting too heavy a burden. And it's the government that's ultimately got to step up as the provider of last resort for those folks who in the recent stimulus package bids and BTOP build-outs illustrate that. Okay, that's our interest. Let's talk about some economic principles that kind of cut through that and get us, I think, to focus on what's going on as we see this amorphous shift from telecommunications to information services. I would take as an article of catechism that the government should be, and when I say government, I mean federal, state, and local government, should be driving toward policies that encourage efficient markets. Now that's an economics term, and it's got some ambiguities when you use it in a lay environment, but basically that means providers and vendors should be charging prices that are correlated with their costs. What does it cost to produce a widget? What does it cost? How much profit is appropriate given the availability of capital in other directions and labor in other directions? And that's going to generate a fairly common rate of return throughout the economy. And when you see someone charging prices that are disconnected from costs or are generating super rates of return beyond that kind of market norm, something's going on. Something's creating inefficiency, and that's not a cost-free result for all of us. We know that it's not so much whether someone controls 80% of the market, it's whether they're able to charge prices that are disconnected from the cost of service. And that tends to be, how easy is it to get in and out of the marketplace? So when you think about a cable provider, you know, it's unlikely the cable provider is going to be subject to effective competition because it is really hard to become a cable provider in your community. Not because of your laws and your regulations, but because of the economics of building that network and competing with the incumbent. So if you really want to see how much monopoly victimization is going on in your community, look at who is able to charge prices, what vendors, not just telecom vendors, but what vendors are able to charge different prices to different consumers. You know, if classic monopoly pricing is when I can pick everyone in this room and charge you all a different price. That's when you know I got a lot of market power. Now, why wouldn't I charge everyone the top price? Since I've got because not everybody will pay that price. You know, a monopolist doesn't charge based on the cost of service. A monopolist charges on the value the consumer attaches to the service. So when you look at the retransmission consent argument between CBS and Time Warner, and why they were, for the first time, not able to resolve that for a month or so. Think of it in terms of Time Warner thinking maybe it's not possible to raise rates much further without losing a lot of subscribers. But I've got a chunk of change here, and CBS wants a share of it. So in the past, I've been able to just simply increase rates to accommodate the broadcasters. Now I can't increase rates anymore. So if I give them what they want, it's going to cut into my monopoly profits. You can begin to see the pressure that builds in that kind of a world. So let's take as a given that it's our role to confront those monopolists when and how we see them, or when we actually see them. Now, if you go back to the 80s and 90s in the telecom world, we had a social compact with the telephone monopoly. And that compact really broke into three specific areas. One, service would be available to everybody, universal availability. Second, service would be universally affordable. And third, long-distance rates would not discriminate against rural versus urban users or distance versus nearby destinations. Now, there was a system of subsidies that sustained that system, but there was no question that there was a common understanding that that's what it meant to be a telephone company. You had to provide service. You had to provide service on a regulated basis. Those rates were non-discriminatory, and there was not a wide variation in rates depending on where you lived in the United States. To get there, we also said, okay, if you want to be a telephone company, you've got to engage in non-discrimination, both in rates and availability of service. You got to treat everyone the same. We used to call it a tariff, but basically all a tariff was a statement of, if you qualify, this is the service you'll get and this is the price you'll pay. And, oh, by the way, company, we don't want you, telephone company, we don't want you controlling the content on the network. The content's going to be controlled by the users and the vendors who use your network, and we're going to have a system of cost-based rate regulation. So we saw that really take place as technology started to change the traditional telephone industry. We saw three major shifts in the regulatory regime to accommodate technology change and still maintain that social compact. The first was the Computer II decision out of the FCC. I mean, there are a lot of other decisions. I'm just going to hit three, I think, that are really the high watermarks. The Computer II decision was really significant because we'd started to see digitalization, and we started to see the telephone network able to convey other than traditional voice messages. And so we had a whole lot of new services that were starting to use the telephone industry that became known as information services. And so the FCC said, well, the way we'll deal with this is we'll allow the telephone companies to actually get into some of that business, but we're going to segregate regulation between the transmission facilities that carry those services and the services that ride over those facilities, which will largely deregulate. A very significant decision and conceptual decision that was sustainable and carried forward really up until the Powell Commission of the FCC that took the concept of information services and really shifted it from what Computer II had talked about.
For other students in history, what year was that?
Do I know Computer II? Harold. The Computer II, 86?
No, earlier.
Oh, I'm sorry, it was 78, wasn't it?
That computer was 1980. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, that 1980. So anyway, so Computer II really did something very significant and very dramatic, and people began making investments in these industries based on the expectation that that's how the world would. I knew where if I got into the facilities business, I was going to be regulated. If I was in the information business, I would not be regulated. That led to the breakup of the AT&T system on antitrust grounds, or it was related to the AT&T breakup in 1982. And what was significant about the breakup, one, not least that it was the Reagan administration that did it, but also that the concept Justice Department had and that the judge carried out was only pieces of this telephone network are natural monopoly. Many pieces of the old Bell system, which was vertically integrated, was taking advantage of the natural monopoly to subsidize and outcompete in the competitive lines of business. So what they wanted to do is break out the natural monopoly as a separate issue and a separate business and spin off the competitive businesses, which resulted in the local telephone companies being spun off and AT&T in 1982 being allowed to move into deregulated long distance and manufacturing. And then that evolved over many years and finally resulted in the 1996 Telecom Act. And the basic principle of the Telecom Act that Congress adopted was where there is a natural monopoly control of the network, then we're going to use regulatory mechanisms to assure competitive services have free access and fair prices to use those monopoly facilities. That was in 96, and the 96 Telecom Act, in a throwaway paragraph, uses the phrase information services, really intending at the time to talk about answering services and white pages and electronic bulletin boards and other kinds of ways that you could send content over the telephone network that should be unregulated. Okay, that's the world we were in, and then all of a sudden digitalization, fiber optics, and internet protocol take off. And the question, I think, for this session is, does that change the social compact? Well, the sessions this morning talked about the details of what is IP technology, and I think what I take from that is the social and the economic principles don't change, but the technology can disrupt where the sources of monopoly power lie. Having said that, that's not an excuse to turn your back on it, okay? I mean, the fact that there are chemical weapons out there that are hard to find and hard to control and hard to bring into the light of day doesn't mean it's a good policy to ignore chemical weapons. And similarly, just because the nature of where the cost structure of these industries is shifting, is changing, doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying principles should change. We know that fiber and digitalization is disruptive. We know that fiber has reduced the cost of construction, which seems to undercut the power of the local monopoly. We know that fiber costs, but we also know fiber costs decrease with increased usage, which means that the more you use the fiber, the more power the fiber owner has. We know digitalization changes and shifts costs of switching and other things. And we know that fiber trumps wireless. But having said that, we still got the same problems. We need universal service that's available and that's affordable. We need non-discrimination, both to subscribers and to information vendors using those networks. And we need non-discriminatory interconnection among the carriers. We need a transparent market. So the job for the folks sitting in this room, to me, is to separate the propaganda from the facts. You know, the fact that we have IP technology does not eliminate monopoly power in the world in which we move, in the world of telecommunications. And we simply have to treat monopoly facilities different than competitive services, or else we will allow the monopolists to dominate the market, and with a huge economic penalty for all of us. So I got some homework for you. What the fibers are doing is, what the providers are doing is they're really saying, let us use fiber and coax, and we'll prevent overbuilds. And once we can prevent the overbuild, then we can turn to creating artificial scarcity on these high-capacity networks. You've heard the word data caps. I mean, to me, the next big fight is really over why exactly are we allowing someone who owns a fiber optic network to charge for additional usage when we know the cost per minute of use goes down, not up, as you put more traffic on that, fiber. And similarly, Gary's really shocking stories about Florida. You know, why are we allowing these folks to withdraw service and not extend service and allow us to emerge into a world of haves and have-nots when it comes to telecommunications? Now, this isn't an easy fight, as evidenced by how little people are talking about it. I mean, there's a reason why this is a relatively silent debate. It's a very tough fight for elected officials to get into. And the folks in this room have to carry it. You have to brief them. They have to understand it. And folks have to make a conscious decision that they're willing to take it on. So, thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I did say this would be worth stopping the chit-chat, right? This is incredibly substantive and important stuff, and that was an amazing presentation. For all of you here, please start thinking about your questions, because even if we run over into the break, I'm going to make a decision that we're going to run over to the break, into the break to take questions. It's worthwhile. And then for those of you who are out on the web, please tee up your questions as well. This is non-functional, so I can't ask you to email me your questions, but my friend Tony Perez here is sitting with a functional phone, tony.perez@seattle.gov. So if you have questions and you're out watching us on the internet, feel free to start sending questions to Tony, and he will be your voice here. Jim Ballard, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Nick. That was great as usual, and I agree with every word you said as always. As Nick said at the outset, I have tended to focus on community-owned network over the last 20 years, as it happens, but...
You're too young to have been doing it for 20 years.
well, actually we have. But today I'm going to focus not on community-owned networks, but on the theme of IP social compacts and the transition, but from the perspective of communities that share my view that high-capacity broadband networks have the capacity to be the electricity of this century as the driver and enabler of virtually everything that we do, and that the ultimate choice of how that should happen is one that should be left to the informed judgment of the local community, because there are so many ways that that can happen. And so to me, that forms a platform for a discussion of social compact at a local level in these times. As Nick noted in his presentation, there is a social compact in the grand sense of a deal between local communities and service providers of all kinds, that in return for access to public assets, the service providers will provide service in the public interest. In a narrower sense, that compact works its way into right-of-way access agreements and cable franchises and pole attachment agreement, tower siting permits, and so on and so forth. Today, it seems that the balance between local governments and service providers in many industries has shifted to the industries, and the question becomes how we deal with that. The kinds of struggles that Nick talked about and that Harold and others will talk about are out there. We need to fight all of those battles. But at the same time, my focus will be communities that want gigabit networks now. Now, how many of you have or would like to have a gigabit network? Okay, so this presentation is for you. Now, over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, gigabit networks as such have gained lots of attention around the world, attributable to many things, including the Google Fiber initiative, developments in Chattanooga, Lafayette, and many other municipal networks, Blair Levin's GigU program, the entry of Gigabit Squared onto the scene with their projects in Seattle and Chicago and elsewhere, the federal stimulus programs, which particularly in the Agriculture Department's programs funded a substantial number of small fiber-to-the-home networks across the country, and the BTOP programs funded middle-mile networks that can serve as feeders to many of these projects. On his way out of the FCC, former Chairman Julius Janikowski introduced a Gigabit Community Challenge to encourage at least one fiber network to emerge in all 50 states by 2015. this growth of interest has caused even AT&T in Austin and Frontier recently in Southern Illinois, CenturyLink in Omaha, to experiment with fiber projects of their own, or at least to discuss the possibility of doing that. There's certainly a lot of controversy around these networks. Are they really necessary? Will they be valuable? Will the benefits ever catch up with the costs? Are they as important as other kinds of investments that communities can be making? Communities won't all answer those questions the same way, because there are so many factors that differ from community to community, and even those communities that want community networks will not be able to get them all at the same time. And so we'll focus here a little bit on again, as I say, not so much the communities that are considering building networks of their own, but those many communities for whom that option is not one that they prefer for one reason or another, but are interested in getting a gigabit network through working with private sector entities. Now, what's common among those communities? Well, for one thing, their goals tend not to be so much communications related as they are what you use the communications networks for: driving economic development and global competitiveness, making educational opportunities available to their residents over their lifetimes and changing in any ways, moving toward more affordable modern health care, and on and on. That's where their focus is. And it may well be that it's not the local officials who have tended to be involved in communications before as regulators or those who supported the regulatory process who are involved in this discussion now. It may be, and it is in fact in many communities, a different set of people who are focusing on those questions. The best happens when in a place like Austin, Rondella, Hawkins steps forward and has a foot in both worlds. That's what we're heading toward, and I would love to see NATOA over the years transition from those who are on the regulatory side to those who focus on all of these issues, and at the same time those who focus on those other issues are more aware and able to understand and apply the regulatory principles that lead to the kinds of values that Nick has talked about. And so I think yikes, how do I go back? Slide.
Try back, actually. Just hit back.
Oh, okay. Okay, so not worth going back on that one, I guess. All right. So what are the options for developing gigabit networks or acquiring them? Well, you can do your own, and it's good if you happen to have a municipal electric utility, but if not, then you have to find some other way to develop such a network, either yourself or in combination with others. You can reach beyond your own city limits and work with adjoining or neighboring communities. You can even do them on a regional basis. Let me add a commercial. We stage periodically conferences focusing on economic development, job creation, and their relationship to broadband communities. And we take apart these questions and focus on them from many different angles. You are all invited to our next such meeting in Chicago in early November 5th through 7th. And we'll look at all these questions in great detail there. Or one can seek one or more private partners. And if your course is to seek one or more private partners, the question is, how does that happen? What would a private partner want from you in order to create a gigabit network in your community? Well, in the simplest of terms, they want as easy, cheap, and fast entry as they can get, and they also want as much support from you in building revenue as quickly as possible. Now, where do I get this? Well, Google and others have said these things many times. GigU created a guidance document for local governments that analyzed what kinds of questions local governments could be thinking about if they want to understand the drivers that motivate private sector potential partners. The Fiber to the Home Council has recently put together a massive community toolkit with many parts, including the guidance that GigU put together. And so when we look at these considerations from the standpoint of the private sector, how do we balance the goals that Nick addressed before and what the private sector is looking for? What are the key issues, and how does that dialogue occur? Where can local governments, consistent with their values, with the need to protect the public's interest, exercise their responsibilities as trustees, and comply with legal requirements that they face, also attract private sector entities? Well, first of all, the way that local governments are tending to do this is to develop requests for information, typically before requests for proposals, or sometimes they're called requests for qualifications, that in essence look inward, find what is strong about the community, what it needs, what its assets are. Essentially, they sell themselves through this document and attract and seek to attract private entities, first and foremost, on the idea that this particular community, for a variety of reasons, is a good place for that company to do business. And that might be because they have industries that are growing, clusters of industries that will be high users of bandwidth. They may have good schools, they may have good water, they may have a good environment. Whatever it is, the communities put themselves out there and say, come and join us. And then a number of industries have looked at the cost and revenue side of things and tried to make themselves attractive that way as well. Now in the rest of this program, I'll just talk about some of the key issues that we've confronted in that conversation and how these things are turning out. One principle that is of cruciating complexity and fascination is the idea of non-discrimination and competitive neutrality. We've heard these words for years. Many states and the federal government require them to some extent. But what do these terms actually mean? Does non-discrimination and competitive neutrality actually mean equal treatment? And I would suggest that it does not. Bob Pepper, when he was the policy director at the FCC, once said there are two kinds of discrimination. One is treating similarly situated entities differently, and the other is treating differently situated entities similarly. So both are discriminatory. And so if someone proposes to come in and overbuild a community that is already occupied by an incumbent that has all those advantages of incumbency. If you want to view the situation of the overbuilder and the incumbent, they're obviously very different. I know that because that's what a court told us in litigation that we had some years ago on behalf of the city of Louisville. It said you can't compare an entrant to an incumbent that's been there for 30 years. It's not an apples to apples comparison. But how do you distinguish? What do you look to? How do you value gigabit service? Do you look at that in terms of the potential jobs that it creates? Do you look at that in terms of the healthcare features? There are any number of ways to do that. And Joanne has been, in particular over the years, a student of all the ways that high-capacity networks create value that is not necessarily reflected in the balance sheet. So there are questions of valuation and measurement, and then there are questions of application. So let's say that you have a sense of value, or at least approximation of value. How do you treat that for the purposes of complying with non-discrimination requirements? Can you, for example, give in-kind credits that could be used to offset pole attachment rates or fees for right-of-way entry? And how do you measure those credits, and how does that actually work? And those are questions that are very actively under discussion in a number of communities today. Build-out requirements. Certainly, we would like to see build-outs through whole communities, and that's in large part probably responsible for why there's so much cable penetration in the communities around the country today, because of build-out requirements that cause their networks to be throughout communities. But build-out requirements don't necessarily have to be for a whole community right away. They can be phased in some reasonable amount to some extent over years. And how that is done is often a significant conversation. Ways to speed construction by dedicating inspectors and others have been ways that some communities have gone about the possibility of encouraging entry, and access to public resources such as fiber and rooftops, conduit, and other ways are all under discussion. And so there are not many of these agreements yet completed. Several are under active discussion right now. This could be the way that in the future, when I ask how many of you have gigabit networks, many hands may go up because you got there through this or other ways. But these are the issues we're discussing. Let me pause there and open for discussion, if you'd like.
Thank you, Jim. I was just about to pass you my 3-minute notes, so well done. Let me invite questions. Please come up to the microphone, and then Tony, if you have any questions coming in. Okay.
Hello, Rick Elrod from Fairfax County. Great presentations. I wanted to follow up on something, on what Nick was saying. The response one frequently hears from the industry is, it isn't a monopoly. Well, we know something about that. It isn't a strict monopoly, let's say, to have these providers. There's wireline, there's wireless, there's satellite, and yet one has the sense that the here consolidated size of these providers somehow enhances their market power, that we're not in the same situation as when you had numerous mom and pop MSOs or 7 Baby Bells, that things are different. Is that the case? Is there some reason why the size of the players also affects the degree to which they can exercise market power? Does it make it easier for them to collude, either actively or tacitly? Does it make it easier for them or more attractive for them not to listen to their customers? What is it that gives our oligopolists now more market power than they had in the 80s and 90s?
Size matters. I don't know how many people saw the Barron's story of 10 days ago, but reporting on Comcast. Comcast is now generating $169 per month average revenues per subscriber. Let me say that again, $169 a month per subscriber. Now that's total, that's voice, data, and video. I can remember having conversations. This is when Joanne was a young woman, and before her pre-NATOA days. I can remember having conversations with cable officers saying, "Did we really think that cable rates were going to get to the $35, $40 level based on the prices that were being paid for cable systems that were swapping at those days? That was the future projected cash flow you'd have to generate to justify the prices that were being paid." Two things have happened with size. One is it's allowed the large companies to have monopsony control over the programmers, as illustrated by the most recent, which was what's so interesting as a bystander watching the retransmission fight with CBS. How much power did Time Warner really have in that world? And it's also forced the operators into a cash flow analysis that has established national standards that are being applied to every franchise area for their general managers. I'm seeing it, for example, in Comcast negotiations in the Washington, D.C. area, where the Comcast negotiators are basically, they don't say it explicitly, but they're bringing the experiences of the company in New England, which has franchises that typically aren't very demanding, to the table to deal with the renewal of these franchises in the Middle Atlantic that actually have quite a few community benefits in it. Now that's solely a function of the central management having a standard about how do we enhance our cash flow on an ongoing basis and having the leverage to do it. The third thing I think is that size from local government standpoint is really disheartening, is it creates a really imbalance in resources in all of these discussions, so that whereas before, if you looked at a large metropolitan area franchise, you knew it was worth nearly $1 trillion. If you work out a community of 600,000 population, a 15-year cable franchise will generate nearly $1 trillion in revenues. You'd think that community would have a lot of leverage in that negotiation, because that's something you'd really want. But in the context of the size of these companies now, they are able to take a longer view of the political season and look at the electeds who are sitting there now and saying, well, 2 years from now I may be dealing with a different city council. And if I can save 5% in my franchise costs over 15 years, that can make it. So size matters. That's part of what's happening. And it's allowed them to get more efficient and more focused on how to actually grab the value that is there. I don't think it has changed the value that is there. I think it's made them more efficient about getting the value out of the network.
I would just add that we may not have real monopolies in that sense, but it's bad enough to have duopolies. The Department of Justice used to not consider duopoly to be a competition because the duopolists don't push themselves very hard. They settle into a state of co-opetition where neither has the incentive to radically drop prices or dramatically increase quality. So what we end up with is at best, the crap that passes for broadband in the U.S. today without really seeing markets broken by the entry of third or fourth major competitors. And that's something that we don't miss as much because we don't see, but it is something that's definitely not there that would be there if we had real competition.
And I'm actually going to take the liberty of adding to this as well. I'm not an economist, but I have spent a long time observing and analyzing broadband use patterns. Calling competition between wireless and wireline competition is just a misnomer. These are different products. They have different needs. They're used in different ways. And the great majority of consumers who have the choice of both will take both. Where you see people just take the one, it's because they have no choice. We don't have wireline competition anymore because we don't have competition between broadband over phone and broadband over cable. That world has pretty much disappeared. In most of our communities, it's cable, and the DSL networks are an afterthought that the phone companies are not really interested in. So it's broadband over cable or wireless, and that wireless product is just a different product, and you can't do the same things on it. So we have this pretense of competition around different services being available, but they're not competing with each other. And we're facing a far more significant monopoly environment than I think is ever acknowledged in Washington.
And we might see over the course of the next couple of years, Charter with John Malone rolling up a number of cable systems, including possibly even Time Warner.
It's going in one direction, and it's not the good one. But Ken Feldman, I think you have a question.
Thank you, Joanne. A question for Jim, although I encourage Nick to weigh in as well. In any of the states that have dealt with anti-municipal broadband legislation, Jim Ballard has been there to help on those fights, and sometimes we've been successful and sometimes not. So, Jim, given your presentation and the move to try to develop more gigabit networks and create partnerships between governments and private entities, what do you see as the trend? Are some of the states that have adopted the restrictions possibly going to roll them back? And you and I have spoken personally, so there is some discussion. I hear more and more people in my state, in Colorado, talking about how can we fix this problem and figure out a way to get more private sector investment in here to help us compete and leverage our existing assets that we can't leverage because of these state restrictions. So your thoughts on where these state laws are going and if there's a way to make some improvements in them?
Well, hard as it is to resist new proposed barriers to entry, it's even more difficult to roll back existing ones or to clarify ambiguous situations and enact favorable legislation. And I really haven't heard of any wave of efforts in the states to try to roll back existing barriers. There's some discussion from time to time, and it has actually happened on occasion. It happened in Virginia, it happened in Tennessee a few years ago, but there's no wave right now that I'm aware of. Just isolated discussion, and I think, frankly, the best thing that could happen would be for more and more gigabit networks to succeed, because that will cast a spotlight on the communities where that is not occurring and will build the pressure for removing barriers to that happening in as many places as possible.
Jim, I think Jim nailed it. The only thought I'd add is that basically this is a political fight, and in politics you have to have it. You need two interest groups to oppose each other before, and then you need some destabilizing event to cause change. And the problem we have with municipal broadband systems is we don't have enough out there to create a constituency. And so you basically have the incumbents fighting for the status quo, and it's very difficult to get enough political oomph to to break that equilibrium, that state of equilibrium, and create disequilibrium in the political process. And that's why I think, you know, Jim's point about creating more community, more one-offs, so that there are more examples, so there's more people saying, why can't I have one of those? That's the way we're going to see substantial change. But it's also evidence of the underlying problem I was trying to address, which is there's enormous power in the incumbencies right now, and the tragedy of the Powell administration was that it allowed the status quo to shift to a different equilibrium, and now we're in the position of trying to change that equilibrium back. And we've got lots of disruptive influences trying to keep that from being a coherent political debate. When you look at the inability to get traditional spokespeople that you would expect on Capitol Hill, an example would be the minority community and the organizations that speak for the minority communities, and how voiceless they've been in the affordability of telecommunications debate in the last 5 years compared to where they were 15 years before. So there's a lot of things that have made the politics really tough, really tough.
Final question, Tony.
Yeah, hi. I know we're short on time. It's not so much a question as a comment, but we've been listening today a lot for the IP transition and what that means. And I guess my comment is that to the extent that this transition to IP leads to a profound erosion of this social compact between network providers and the communities they serve, then it seems to me that then having the ability to respond structurally by taking your own view and building your own network is the ultimate leverage that any community is going to have.
Well, I was just thinking of Franklin Roosevelt's comment back in 1932 that it isn't even necessarily the building of the networks that does that. It's the power to be able to do that. And that's something that we need to hold on to with as firm a grip as we can. Because as long as we have the ability to take matters into our own hands, as the communities that have already done it, that has enormous impact in the market. Not profound across the country yet, but if you approach this issue serious about following through, all of a sudden things that never would have happened in your community happen. It's happened time and time again. It's not the ultimate solution, but it has enormous value, that ability to take matters into your own hands when you have the incumbents not delivering the quality of services or the prices or the support that you're looking for.
Nick?
No.
This is a topic that we're actually going to revisit in a slightly different format, but with a discussion of what is the local stake in this and all the underlying principles of why local governments are at the table in a general session on Thursday. So let me encourage you all to be there, because it's an incredibly important conversation about how we protect the community interest as technology changes. But I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much, Nick and Jim. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I think we're on break. I don't have a schedule in front of me. We're on break until 1:30. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.